When my grandson was born, the security guard stopped me at the maternity ward and said, "Your daughter-in-law only authorized her mother." I stood there holding a small blue blanket I had knitted myself, the soft yarn still carrying the faint scent of lavender from the sachets in my linen closet. And for a moment, I thought he must have mistaken me for someone else because I had been counting down to this day for 9 long months, marking each doctor's appointment on the calendar pinned beside my refrigerator, setting aside money from my Social Security check to buy a sturdy oak rocking chair for the corner of my living room, the kind that would last through more than one grandchild. The hospital lobby was bright and spotless, the floors polished so clean they reflected the overhead lights, and I could hear the distant echo of a newborn crying somewhere beyond the secured doors, a thin, miraculous sound that made my chest tighten with something that felt like pride and longing all at once. I had driven 42 miles that morning from my small house in Dayton to the hospital in Columbus, leaving before sunrise so I wouldn't miss the first chance to see my grandson, the first Collins boy of a new generation. And I had imagined my son Daniel meeting me at the entrance with tired eyes and a grateful smile, placing that tiny bundle in my arms while I whispered the same lullaby I used to sing to him when he was just 6 pounds and red-faced, and squalling in a bassinet beside my bed. Instead, I was being asked to wait in a plastic chair near the vending machines while Emily's mother walked freely past the security desk with a visitor badge clipped neatly to her cardigan. I nodded politely to the guard and said I understood, because I have always believed that dignity is something you carry even when your hands are empty. But as I sat down, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. Over the past few months, there had been small signs I chose not to read too closely, like the way Emily would say they wanted a quiet delivery, and how Daniel's replies to my texts grew shorter, more careful, as if every word had to pass through someone else's approval first. I told myself young couples need space, that times are different now, that maybe I was old-fashioned for assuming a grandmother would be welcomed into the delivery room waiting area without formal permission. Still, I had spent evenings assembling a crib in my guest room, measuring the walls for pale yellow paint, folding tiny cotton onesies into neat stacks, because in my heart I believed there would be weekends filled with soft coos and the steady rhythm of a rocking chair on hardwood floors. Watching Emily's mother disappear through those locked doors while I remained on the other side felt like standing outside my own life, observing it through glass. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply held that blanket in my lap and listened to the hum of the soda machine beside me, letting the reality settle slowly, like dust in a quiet room, realizing that the role I had imagined for myself in my grandson's first hours had already been decided without me. I sat in that plastic chair for almost 2 hours, watching the automatic doors slide open and shut as nurses came and went with clipboards pressed to their chests, families carrying balloons tied with pale blue ribbons, and husbands pacing with coffee cups they never seemed to drink. Every time the elevator chimed, my heart lifted for a second, thinking Daniel might step out and wave me over, but the doors would open to strangers whose faces carried the kind of joy I had imagined for myself. I kept my hands folded over the blanket in my lap, smoothing the edges as if I could iron out the quiet ache building inside me. The television mounted in the corner played a daytime talk show at low volume, laughter rising and falling in the background, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another world where grandmothers were invited in without question. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A photo appeared on the screen before any words did. It was a picture of Emily in the hospital bed, her hair brushed neatly over her shoulders, Daniel standing beside her with one arm around her, and in the center, wrapped tightly in a white hospital blanket, was my grandson. The caption read, "He is here. 7 pounds, 9 ounces. Everyone is healthy." I stared at that word, everyone, longer than I should have. I typed back, "Congratulations. He is beautiful. I am so proud of you." I erased the sentence twice before sending it because I did not want even a hint of hurt to slip through. A few minutes later, Daniel replied, "Thanks, Mom. We are keeping things calm today. We will let you know when we are ready for visitors." I read that message 3 times. Keeping things calm, as if my presence would disturb the air around them. I remembered the day Daniel was born, how the small county hospital allowed my mother to sit beside me for hours, holding my hand while the nurses moved quietly around us. No one asked for authorization. No one checked a list. Family simply meant family. I told myself that policies had changed, that hospitals were stricter now, that maybe this was all about safety and not about exclusion. Still, I could not ignore the image of Emily's mother already inside, probably taking turns holding the baby, whispering into his tiny ear, memorizing the curve of his cheeks. I stood up and walked toward the large window at the end of the hallway that overlooked the parking lot. My sedan sat alone near the far curb, the afternoon sun glinting off the windshield. I had packed a small cooler in the trunk with homemade chicken soup and oatmeal cookies because I remembered how exhausted I felt after giving birth, how a warm meal tasted like comfort when everything else felt overwhelming. Now that cooler felt like a relic of an outdated assumption. I remained there until a nurse approached and gently asked if I was waiting for someone specific. I smiled and said, "Not today." I gathered my purse, folded the blanket carefully, and walked back through the sliding doors into the crisp Ohio air. The drive home felt longer than 42 miles. The highway stretched ahead in quiet lines, and I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, telling myself that love does not demand immediate access, that patience is another form of strength. But as the hospital faded in my rearview mirror, I understood that something subtle had shifted, something I could not yet name, and that the first hours of my grandson's life had already drawn a boundary I had never expected to see. I did not tell anyone that I cried when I pulled into my driveway that afternoon. I waited until I was inside my house, until the front door was locked and the quiet wrapped around me like a familiar shawl, and then I set the cooler on the kitchen counter and leaned both hands against the sink. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, the same clock that had marked the hours of Daniel's childhood, the nights I stayed up sewing Halloween costumes at the last minute, the mornings I packed his lunch before driving him to Little League practice. I opened the cooler and placed the untouched containers of soup in the refrigerator, lining them up neatly, as if order could soften disappointment. The house felt larger than usual, every room holding the echo of plans I had made in anticipation of a baby's visit. The guest room door was still open, revealing the freshly assembled crib near the window, sunlight falling across the pale yellow walls I had painted 2 weekends earlier. I walked inside and ran my hand along the smooth wooden rail, remembering how carefully I had measured the space, making sure there was at least 3 feet between the crib and the dresser for safety, reading guidelines online to ensure everything met modern standards. I had even installed blackout curtains to help the baby sleep during summer afternoons. Standing there, I understood that preparation does not guarantee participation. That evening, I received another message from Daniel. He said they were exhausted and that they would not be having visitors for a few days. He added that Emily needed rest and privacy. I replied that I completely understood and that I was praying for all 3 of them. I meant it. Love does not disappear simply because it is not acknowledged. Still, as the days passed, I began to notice a pattern that felt less like hospital policy and more like preference. Social media told a story I was not part of. Photos appeared of Emily's mother holding the baby in a rocking chair beside the hospital bed. Then later at their house, standing in the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder, smiling as if she had always belonged in that space. The caption spoke about grateful hearts and supportive family. I pressed the small heart icon beneath the pictures because I would never allow bitterness to define me, but I could not ignore the quiet question rising in my chest. When did I move? From being essential to being optional. I remembered the months leading up to the birth, the baby shower held in Emily's sister's backyard where I arrived with a silver rattle engraved with my grandson's initials. I had offered to host the shower myself, but Emily said it would be easier this way. Easier for whom? I wondered now. At the shower, I noticed that most of the decorations had been chosen by her side of the family, soft greens and creams, carefully coordinated, while I stood near the lemonade table introducing myself to distant cousins I had never met. Daniel had kissed my cheek that day and told me not to worry, that I would have plenty of time with the baby once he arrived. I held on to those words like a promise. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, I began to understand that access is sometimes granted quietly and just as quietly withheld. I did not raise my voice. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I opened the drawer where I kept important documents and stared at the neatly organized folders inside, realizing that if my place in this new chapter was going to be limited, then I would need to reconsider how much of myself I continued to offer without question. I left the folder in the drawer that night, but I did not close it without noticing what was inside. My will, neatly typed and signed 5 years ago, still listed Daniel as the primary beneficiary of everything I owned. From the house with its paid-off mortgage to the modest savings account I had built dollar by dollar over 4 decades of work. There was also a separate document establishing a college fund I had opened the week Emily told us she was expecting. I had walked into my local bank with a smile that morning, asking the young teller to help me set up an account that would grow quietly over the next 18 years. I remember feeling proud as I signed the paperwork, imagining my grandson one day walking across a stage in a cap and gown, never knowing how many small sacrifices had helped him get there. Now, sitting at my dining table under the soft yellow light, I ran my fingers along the edge of those papers and asked myself a simple question. Was I investing in a future I would not be allowed to share? The following Sunday, Daniel called. His voice sounded tired but cheerful, the way new fathers often sound when they are balancing excitement with sleepless nights. He told me the baby was healthy and that they were adjusting to a new routine. I listened carefully for any invitation, any small opening that suggested I could stop by with groceries or offer to hold the baby while they rested. Instead, he said they were keeping visits limited to avoid overstimulation. I pictured my grandson, no larger than a loaf of bread, somehow needing protection from the quiet presence of his grandmother. I told Daniel I understood. I told him to focus on his little family. After we hung up, I stood in the living room and looked at the rocking chair I had purchased from a furniture store 2 towns over. It had cost nearly $800, more than I usually spend on myself, but I had chosen solid oak because I wanted it to last through generations. I sat down and pushed gently against the floor with my slippered foot. The chair moved in a smooth, steady rhythm. Back and forth, back and forth. The room remained silent. In that stillness, memories rose without invitation. I saw Daniel at age 8, sitting at the kitchen counter while I helped him with math homework after finishing a 10-hour shift at the grocery store. I saw him at 16, heartbroken after his first breakup, leaning against my shoulder while I told him that rejection does not define a person's worth. I remembered selling my wedding ring after my husband passed away because tuition at the community college had increased by nearly $2,000 that year, and I did not want Daniel to carry debt into adulthood. I had never once considered those sacrifices a burden. They were simply what a mother does. But now I began to see a quiet imbalance. Access to my grandson was being rationed, while my resources remained fully available. I rose from the rocking chair and walked back to the drawer. This time, I took the folder out completely and placed it on the table. I did not act out of anger. I acted out of clarity. If I was no longer essential in the earliest days of my grandson's life, then I needed to ensure that my generosity reflected my actual place in this new family structure. Love can be unconditional, but inheritance does not have to be. And for the first time since the hospital, I felt something steady beneath my disappointment. Not resentment, not revenge, just the calm understanding that boundaries, even quiet ones, are sometimes the only language left to speak. The next morning I called the attorney who had handled my husband's estate nearly a decade ago. His office was still on Main Street, above the bakery that fills the block with the smell of fresh bread by 8 o'clock every day. I scheduled an appointment for Thursday at 10:30 in the morning. My voice did not shake when I gave my name. I did not explain the reason over the phone. I simply said I needed to review my documents. When Thursday arrived, I dressed carefully in a navy skirt and a cream blouse, the same outfit I used to wear to parent-teacher conferences when Daniel was in high school. There is something steadying about looking composed, even when your thoughts are shifting underneath. The attorney greeted me warmly, asking about my grandson, assuming, of course, that I had already been fully welcomed into his world. I smiled and said he was healthy, which was true. Then I placed my folder on the polished wooden desk and told him I wanted to make adjustments. We went through each page slowly. The house, the savings, the small investment account, the college fund. I asked detailed questions about trusts, about conditional distributions, about how funds could be structured to protect long-term intentions rather than immediate access. I did not speak with bitterness. I spoke with precision. By the time I left his office, the paperwork was not yet finalized, but the direction was clear. The majority of my estate would be placed into a trust for my grandson, to be managed independently until he reached an age where he could make his own decisions. Daniel would not have direct control. Neither would Emily. On my drive home, I felt lighter, not because I had taken something away, but because I had aligned my generosity with reality. That weekend, Daniel called again. His tone was different this time, slightly strained. He mentioned that Emily's mother would be returning to her home in Chicago soon, and that they were beginning to realize how exhausting newborn nights could be. He laughed softly and said they had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch. I listened quietly. Then he asked, almost casually, if I might be available to help for a few afternoons next week. I paused, just long enough for the silence to register, but not long enough to sound resentful. I told him I would need to check my schedule. In truth, my calendar was nearly empty, but I had already decided that my time would no longer be offered automatically. We agreed that he would call back with specific days. After we ended the conversation, I walked into the guest room again. The crib stood ready. The rocking chair waited beside it. Nothing in the room had changed, yet something inside me had settled into a new shape. I was still his mother. I was still that baby's grandmother. But I was no longer standing outside a locked door hoping to be invited in. I was choosing when and how I would step forward. And for the first time since I sat in that hospital hallway, I felt that the balance had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for me to know that I would never again confuse silence with surrender. Daniel called back on Monday evening with specific days and times, his voice carrying that careful politeness people use when they need something. He said Wednesday and Friday afternoons would help the most, especially between 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock, because that was when Emily tried to nap. I told him I could come on Wednesday from 1 to 4. I left the extra hour unsaid on purpose. When I arrived at their house that week, I noticed how tidy everything looked from the outside. The small American flag still planted neatly beside the porch steps, the welcome mat aligned perfectly under the front door. Emily opened the door before I could knock twice. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that stops at the mouth. She thanked me for coming and explained that the baby had just fallen asleep. I stepped inside and removed my shoes without being asked. The house smelled faintly of baby powder and fresh laundry. Daniel appeared from the hallway holding my grandson, who looked impossibly small against his broad chest. For a moment, everything else faded. Daniel placed the baby carefully into my arms, and I felt the warm weight settle against me. Barely 8 pounds of new life breathing softly beneath a cotton blanket. I did not cry. I simply rocked gently from side to side, counting each breath as if memorizing proof that he was real. Emily watched closely, offering instructions about how he preferred to be held, reminding me to support his head, even though I had done this before. I nodded and followed her directions without argument. The afternoon passed quietly. I washed bottles, folded tiny onesies, and wiped down the kitchen counters while Daniel caught up on sleep in the bedroom. Emily remained nearby, correcting small details, explaining their routine, clarifying feeding times down to the minute. I listened. I adapted. I left at exactly 4 o'clock. On the drive home, I reflected on how carefully access was being managed. I was allowed in, but only within boundaries that felt measured and supervised. Friday arrived with similar conditions. This time, Emily handed me a written list taped to the refrigerator, outlining the baby's schedule in half-hour increments. I followed it precisely. I did not overstep. I did not offer unsolicited advice. Yet, even within that structured afternoon, I sensed a quiet evaluation, as though my competence was being tested rather than trusted. When Daniel walked me to the door that evening, he thanked me and mentioned how expensive childcare would be once Emily returned to work in a few months. He said they were considering options, but that family help would make a big difference financially. I met his eyes steadily and told him I understood that raising a child required planning. I did not volunteer beyond the agreed hours. I did not suggest open-ended availability. As I drove back along the highway, the sky turning orange over the Ohio fields, I realized that the dynamic had become clear. My presence was convenient when needed and distant when not. But I was no longer uncertain about my value. I had already taken steps to ensure that what I built over a lifetime would not be treated as an automatic extension of someone else's convenience. And as the miles passed beneath my tires, I felt calm, knowing that quiet strength does not announce itself. It simply waits for the moment when it is recognized. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt carefully measured. I arrived only when asked. I left exactly when agreed. I never extended my stay, even when the baby's small fingers wrapped around mine as if asking me not to go. Emily returned to work sooner than expected, taking on remote meetings from the dining room table while I held my grandson in the living room. She wore a headset and spoke in a professional tone about deadlines and projections, and I could hear the faint click of her keyboard while I rocked the baby in steady, quiet motions. Daniel began mentioning numbers more often. He talked about the rising cost of formula, the price of diapers, the estimate they had received for daycare once Emily resumed full-time hours. One afternoon, while I was warming a bottle, he said that full-time childcare in their area could run close to $1,200 a month. He said it casually, but the number hung in the air between us. I nodded and said that raising children has never been inexpensive. He smiled, perhaps expecting me to offer a solution. I did not. Instead, I focused on the baby's feeding schedule and wrote down the ounces he finished, just as Emily preferred. Later that week, Emily approached me directly. She thanked me for helping and said they had been discussing a more consistent arrangement. She explained that if I could commit to 3 full days a week, it would ease their financial strain significantly. She added that it would also allow the baby to bond with family rather than strangers. I listened without interrupting. Her tone was polite, but there was an assumption beneath it, as though my time naturally belonged to their plan. I asked what hours they had in mind. She suggested 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening. 9 hours. 3 days a week. 27 hours total. I calculated quietly. At 68 years old, I had earned the right to choose how I spent my days. I told her I would consider it and let them know by Sunday. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same place where I had reviewed my documents. I opened my calendar and looked at the empty squares. There were church mornings, a weekly lunch with 2 friends from my old job, and the volunteer shift at the local library I had recently begun. Nothing that could not be moved. Yet something inside me resisted the automatic yes I might have given years ago. I thought about the hospital hallway. I thought about the visitor authorization list. I thought about how access had been controlled when I was the one asking for it. By Sunday afternoon, Daniel called, clearly expecting confirmation. I told him I would continue helping 1 afternoon a week, as we had been doing, but I would not be able to commit to full days on a regular basis. There was a pause on the line. He asked if something was wrong. I answered honestly, nothing is wrong. I simply have commitments of my own. He sounded surprised, perhaps because he had never considered that I might draw a boundary without anger. After we hung up, I felt the same calm steadiness I had felt leaving the attorney's office. I still loved my grandson with every part of me. I would still show up, but I would do so by choice, not by obligation. And for the first time, I sensed that Daniel understood, even if he did not fully agree, that I was no longer standing outside their lives waiting to be let in. I was deciding how wide my own door would open. The following week felt different. Not colder, not louder, just more aware. When I arrived on Wednesday afternoon, Emily greeted me with the same careful smile, but there was a new attentiveness in her eyes, as if she were recalibrating her understanding of me. Daniel had likely told her about my decision. The baby was nearly 6 weeks old by then, his cheeks fuller, his cries stronger, his tiny fingers gripping with surprising determination. I held him close and breathed in the clean scent of baby lotion while Emily prepared for an online meeting. There was no written schedule taped to the refrigerator that day. Instead, she explained the routine verbally and asked if I felt comfortable managing it. I answered that I had raised a child before and that I would follow whatever rhythm worked best for the baby. She nodded, and for the first time, there was a small pause where instruction might have been. That afternoon passed quietly, but something subtle had shifted. Daniel returned home earlier than usual and sat beside me on the couch while I rocked his son. He watched us for a long moment and then said, almost thoughtfully, that he had not realized how much experience I carried until he became a father himself. It was not an apology, but it was acknowledgement. I did not press for more. I simply adjusted the blanket around the baby's shoulders and continued rocking. A few days later, Daniel invited me to dinner on Sunday evening. He said they wanted to thank me properly for the help I had been giving. When I arrived, the table was set with 3 plates and a small bassinet positioned near the end of the couch. Emily had prepared baked chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. It was a simple meal, but intentional. During dinner, Daniel spoke openly about their budget, about the strain of balancing mortgage payments, student loans, and childcare costs. He admitted that they had assumed I would naturally step in without limits. Emily listened quietly and then added that she had been protective after the birth because she felt overwhelmed and uncertain. She said she had wanted control over at least one thing during a time when everything felt unpredictable. I heard her words carefully. I remembered my own early days of motherhood, the exhaustion, the fear of making mistakes. For the first time, I allowed space for the possibility that not every exclusion had been calculated. Still, boundaries remain necessary even when intentions are complicated. I told them I would continue helping one afternoon each week and occasionally more when I chose, but that I valued maintaining my own schedule and independence. I explained that I had structured my financial plans to prioritize the baby's long-term future rather than immediate convenience. Daniel looked surprised but did not argue. Emily asked what I meant, and I simply said that I had arranged my estate to ensure stability for the next generation. There was silence for a few seconds, not tense, but thoughtful. The baby stirred in his bassinet, letting out a soft cry that filled the room. Daniel stood to pick him up, and as he cradled his son, I saw a flicker of understanding cross his face. That evening ended without raised voices, without confrontation. When I drove home under the dim glow of streetlights, I felt steady again. Not triumphant, not resentful, just clear. I had not closed my door to them. I had simply made sure that when they stepped through it, they understood it was my choice to open it. By the time my grandson turned 3 months old, our arrangement had settled into something steady and understood. I came every Wednesday afternoon, sometimes bringing a small container of homemade soup or a loaf of banana bread, not because I was trying to earn my place, but because generosity is part of who I am. Emily no longer hovered as closely when I held the baby. She would step into her office space with the door half closed, trusting that I knew how to soothe him when his cries grew sharp or how to pace the living room floor when he fought sleep. Daniel began calling me in the evenings just to ask simple questions about teething or feeding amounts, his tone no longer cautious but genuinely curious. One afternoon, as I sat in the rocking chair at their house with my grandson resting against my shoulder, Daniel lowered himself into the chair across from me and said he had been thinking about the early days at the hospital. He admitted that he had allowed decisions to be made without considering how they would affect me. He said he had assumed there would always be time to fix small hurts later. I looked at him carefully and told him that time does not erase first impressions, but it does allow room for growth. I did not recount the hallway. I did not repeat the words that had been spoken. He already knew. A week later, Emily asked if I would like to join them for a pediatrician appointment. It was a small invitation, but a meaningful one. I sat in the examination room while the doctor measured the baby's length and weight, explaining that he was in the 65th percentile for his age. I listened as Daniel asked about sleep cycles and vaccination schedules. When the appointment ended, Emily handed me the diaper bag without hesitation while she adjusted her coat. It was a quiet gesture of inclusion. On the drive home, Daniel followed my car instead of leading the way, as if symbolically allowing me to set the pace for once. That evening, after they left, I walked into my guest room and sat in the oak rocking chair I had purchased. Months earlier, the room no longer felt like a waiting space. It felt prepared. The trust documents had been finalized by then, signed and filed properly. I had ensured that my grandson's future would be secure, not as leverage, but as legacy. My boundaries had not pushed my family away. They had clarified the terms of respect. I understood now that love without structure can be mistaken for obligation, and obligation rarely invites gratitude. But love with boundaries commands acknowledgement. I had not needed to raise my voice or demand recognition. I had simply adjusted my response. And in doing so, I watched the dynamic shift, slowly and naturally, like a tide turning without announcement. When I close my eyes now and hold my grandson close, I do not feel like a visitor. I feel like a grandmother who chose her place and kept her dignity. The door that once felt locked is no longer something I wait beside. It opens because it is understood that I walk through it by choice, not by permission.